Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome, welcome. My name is Corinne Ernie. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Parish Art Museum. And I'm excited about this panel tonight. It's a discussion that's held in conjunction with the wonderful exhibition on view right now, James Brooks, A Painting is a Real Thing. You will have some time to look at it after the talk. And this panel tonight has a special focus on the life that James Brooks and his wife, the painter Charlotte Park, shared in their spring studio about their practice and also their evolution. So this panel is organized in collaboration with the Brooks Park Arts and Nature Center, so thank you very much. I think some of you are here tonight. Thank you. And I want to introduce the panelists tonight. Klaus Ottmann, who is the adjunct curator of the collection and also the guest curator of the exhibition that we have on view right now. Helen Harrison, who is the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thaw director of the Paula Krasner House and Study Center. And artist Mike Solomon, and it's moderated by our parish collection artist, Scott Bludorn. So please, panelists, if you want to make your way to the stage. And last but not least, I want to thank our Friday night sponsor, the Corcoran Group. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Scott Bludorn. I'm an East Hampton-based artist and also a member of the Brooks Park Art and Nature Committee, which is a fledgling organization that is involved with the protection and restoration of the property, which was formerly James Brooks and Charlotte Park's studio in East Hampton. I'd like to thank Parish Executive Director Monica Ramirez Montagu as Chief Curator Corinne Ernie for this wonderful opportunity tonight. And I'd like to now introduce our panelists, which include Dr. Klaus Ottmann, Helen Harrison, and Mike Solomon. And they've all been very instrumental in the effort to bring forth the work of James Brooks and Charlotte Park, especially with James Brooks and this show that we have here at the parish. And it's been a couple of years kind of in the making, as far as I can understand. The thread of the panel here tonight is that we have a great moment of American history, and which is encapsulated on the East End of Long Island. Artists, critics, poets, historians, and locals converged here, expanding upon a vibrant post-war community that was unique in its creative intellect, complexity, and dynamism. The preservation of our cultural history, from Thomas and Mary Nimmo Moran's studio in East Hampton to the Paula Krasner House and Study Center in Springs, has been vital to the New York story. Another significant landmark is the home and studios of artists James Brooks and Charlotte Park, located on 11 acres of lush woodlands and springs, now known as the Brooks Park Arts and Nature Center. We're thrilled to be here this evening to celebrate the work of James Brooks and Charlotte Park and to explore their lives and practices, two remarkable artists who left an indelible mark on this important place. So I'd like to open up our conversation tonight by we're going to explore this kind of thematically, and there's a lot of kind of material that we can talk about in terms of James Brooks' art and life, Charlotte, his wife, the studio, their ethos as artists and humans, I think, who lived in this very important place, which became this artist community. And it's really something very special. And just to add an anecdote, I was first introduced to the property in 2011 by my friend John Mullen, who was familiar with the property and brought me to go see this place, which I didn't know what I was getting myself into. This was this backwoods lot in the depths of the Springs woods, and these buildings which kind of appeared out of this long driveway. And I remember entering this old studio that looked very, prominent in the woods, and just being blown away by what I was looking at. It seemed as if the artist had just left 10 minutes ago. There's two studios on the property at Charlotte Parks, and then Jim's was the larger studio. And there were still paper and paints and paintbrushes just sitting kind of in place. So I became really enthralled with this idea of the artists and their life here, and it made me just so interested to kind of pursue the story, and I became involved in this project. So I'd like to start with Mike. So Mike Solomon, you knew Jim and Charlotte personally. Can you discuss their practices, their daily life, and their relationship with the local art community, and the local business owners, homeowners, fishermen? What was that like?
Is that all? Well, I was very lucky because they were great friends of my parents, and they did not have children, and I happened to just be about the right age, that I wasn't too young to be a pain in the ass, and not too old to be a pain in the ass. So probably at about age 5 or 6, they would sometimes kind of take me, babysit me, or whatever. And so from that point on, they were really kind of like aunts and uncles. And as I was raised by an artist, I maybe innately understood something of what was going on. But as I grew older and wanted to be an artist myself, well, then they really did become mentors. They were very exemplary in the sense that they really understood the arc of what was important, I think. Their priorities were in order, I guess is the way you would put it, and that they understood that the act of being creative needed to be respected on a lot of levels that I think that people today don't really understand. It wasn't something that you just did every once in a while or that you did in certain hours. It was an entire life that had to be molded so that everything in it was sort of creative, was sort of adding to it. So the way the houses were set on the property, for instance, they bought that in '55, I think. After the hurricane blew the studio apart in Montauk in '54, they sent the house by barge to Acquatic Harbor and then brought it in. And that was they were environmentalists. I mean, they were not going to throw the house away. They were going to save it. And then they set the house. It's got to be, I don't know, 600, 700 feet off the road. And then the studios are farther into the woods, as you talked about. So they were already setting up this lifestyle, this rhythm that, imagine getting up in the morning, have a cup of coffee, and I'm going to walk through the woods for 800 feet or 1,000 feet to get to the studio. Already you're in the right space because, everything was like that there. Everything had been accounted for in terms of being at your optimum when you were in front of a canvas or whatever. And that's what they were about. They really got that. So they didn't party very hard. I mean, they were part of that group of people like my parents who were very much social, and they were very social, but they didn't drink hard. They didn't waste themselves. And of course, it's kind of like Jim and Pollock were kind of like two sides of the same coin. So and maybe Pollock was kind of a cautionary tale, but Jim was never going to go there. He didn't have that character. He really had a very kind and loving and stable character, but not boring. And that's what made it so interesting, that someone that kind of had it together was not boring, was really very provocative in when he would talk about art, as Klaus knows. So I'd say that's kind of the answer to that. And Charlotte was kind of the same. She was, they were together because they were similar. They were kind of not Puritan, but simple.
Did they participate in heated debate about, say, abstraction or art making? Did they have conversations like that outwardly?
I mean, yeah, it was in the Erasables picture. I mean, I think that they cared about those things. But heated debate, don't think that Jim or Charlotte ever. Charlotte was a little bit more fiery than Jim. She was a Leo. But she was a New Englander, so she had that to temper her character. I don't think it was as we picture it, sort of these kind of people really cared, but at least with them, they didn't stomp their heels or clench their fists. You know, it was a much more nuanced kind of expression of dissatisfaction with certain things, and a pursuit of what was good rather than kind of spending time as to what was bad.
Klaus, can you tell us about the title of the exhibition, A Painting is a Real Thing? How is it derived? And did Hans Hofmann's terms, art of the real, have an impact on this statement?
Sure. So the title is a paraphrase of something that Brooks said in a conversation with April Kingsley in 1975. And I brought it here now. Some of you were on the tour, heard it already, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. So it was in context of talking about how he likes to live in the paintings as he was making them. And sometimes he lives in them a little bit too long. But he says, sometimes I live too long, but I do get a good deal of satisfaction out of staying in a painting, manipulating the forms, changing things, and primarily listening to what it speaks and encouraging it. And then he says, painting isn't just inanimate, it's a real thing. That's where the quote comes from. Like a strong personality, and if a painter doesn't treat it so, it won't affect him or other people. I think it's a beautiful quote, and the fact that, you know, the way how he approaches painting, basically he lives inside the painting while he's making it, which is a beautiful kind of poetic notion. And also, you know, he considers paintings, even when they're abstract paintings, something that's real, something that's alive, and I think that's also really incredible. In regards to Hans Hofmann, so Hans Hofmann did write an essay in 1948 called In Search for the Real. And in the essay he says, the real in art never dies because its nature is predominantly spiritual. But I looked into this, and Brooks said that he knew Hofmann's, you know, work. He never met him, but he wasn't very knowledgeable about his ideas. So it's possible that he read this, you know, text. It was a very you know, well-known book. But I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he's talking about something much more personal, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of, you know, approaching a painting like a living thing that he actually kind of lives with and lives inside.
So these artists were kind of they were well known in New York, kind of at the time before moving to the Springs. Helen, can you talk a little bit about how that transition affected their work, or how did they still have a one foot in the New York art world while coming to the Springs, or?
Well, they did. In fact, before they were married, they moved into Jackson and Lee's apartment on A Street when Jackson and Lee moved out here. They shared it with one of Jackson's brothers, because it was right at the end of the war. Housing was even worse than it is now, all the boys coming back from the front looking for a place to live. So that they had to have the two sharing the apartment. But they had known Jackson and Lee before the war, especially Jackson's brother Sanford worked with Jim on the mural, the LaGuardia mural. So they were friendly from earlier through the WPA. But I think that the move to Springs, as it did for Jackson and Lee, really kind of opened them up visually and creatively to expand the scope of their work. Not that Charlotte never worked terribly large. Jim's work is much larger. But, and he also worked small. As you can see, the exhibition is a beautiful survey of a whole range of his work. But I was particularly thrilled to see the LaGuardia mural because I'm dating myself now, but I remember it from my childhood. We used to go to the Marine Air Terminal to watch the seaplanes come in. And if you had to go to the toilet, you went inside the terminal. And there it was, 237 feet around and 12 feet tall. And it was absolute, for a kid, it was absolutely stunning. And when it went away, it was just this green circle. It was weird. But I happened to be working at the Queen's Museum when Alan Ferrance was hired to restore it. And I was there at the ceremony when it was rededicated in 1980, and Jim and Charlotte were there. I had met them earlier when I was doing my WPA New Deal research, and that's the first encounter that I had with them, was interviewing them for this particular project. But I found Jim to be so open, so willing to share his memories of this. And at the time, when I first met him, the mural was still painted over.
And how was it painted over, and why?
Well, you had to be there in the 50s. It was the McCarthy era, and anything to do with the WPA, anything to do with the New Deal was considered socialistic. And I remember in particular, there's a figure, it's not in this beautiful, amazing reproduction, just fabulous. But on one of the other quadrants, there's a figure of an astronomer looking through the ceiling, like he made a trompe l'oeil hole in the ceiling. And you look up, and the astronomer is looking up to the future. That was considered socialistic, because it's like Soviet art. And this could not be any farther from Soviet art, but anyway, that was the attitude. And they just said, you know, we're getting rid of it, and they painted it over, fortunately with some kind of industrial house paint. But the painting itself was done with an experimental material called Glyptol, which was developed by the WPA. And it was not compatible with the CERT overpaint. So Ferrance and his team were able to dissolve use a solvent on the overpaint and leave the paint underneath. So that was fortunate, because some of these murals, well, when I first met Jim, I am going way off topic, I am so sorry, but I have to tell you that when I first met him, he told me that the Woodside Library, where he had done a mural, was sold by the post office, the Woodside Post Office. It was sold by the Post Office Department to a private developer. And he opened a package in the mail one day, and there was a 1-foot square of his mural with his signature on it, and a note: "Dear Mr. Brooks, we're ripping this off the wall, and if you'd like to buy it from us, we'll charge you X number of dollars per foot." And of course, he was devastated.
That's
but,
chutzpah.
I mean, yeah. And he said, of course, he did not buy the mural, but this is the kind of disrespect that people had for New Deal era art. And, you know, fortunately, some of it does survive, but in that case, it did not. But at least there was an afterlife for the LaGuardia mural, the largest WPA mural in the country. And a magnificent composition. I mean, imagine, it took him 4 years to do it, and of course, he had a whole team of assistants. So this was really a huge labor, and obviously helped him learn how to compose a picture, how to structure a composition, and how to really get across the imagery on such a huge scale.
Right. So this was kind of his realist stage in his artistic career, but then he became really well known as this abstract expressionist.
Well, there are abstract elements too. The
There, of
overdoor
course,
panels
yes.
are all
But we have
abstracted
recognizable figures and-
aviation
Yeah.
symbolism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he talks about that. He already at the time became interested in abstraction, and so
Right.
he was able to incorporate the decorative elements in an abstract way into that mural.
Well, that wonderful little painting that you have in that same gallery toward the door, where there's a building and it looks like some sort of edging from the roof that just elevated itself and levitated off the roof, and then this little strand of a tree coming up, and it's almost like a de Chirico. It's just got that wonderful kind of presence in a tiny little format. So he clearly knew how to build a picture.
And Mike, can you kind of elaborate a little bit about your relationship to abstract expressionism, and maybe if there's a distinction between the first and the second generation abstract expressionists?
I think that at this point in time, we would probably tend to not see it as such a clear line that it used to be. It had something to do with, you know, the first group to do it and then the second group to do it, but there's so many new pieces of information that when you look at people's age, it doesn't really work out too cleanly. But I think that it was more whether or not, you know, there were these first originators. It really has more to do with who was then as opposed to now. If you were not original, you were not in the game. You had to have your own way of making marks. You had to have your own approach to things. There was no appropriation, or if there was, it was very, very, very well worked out. Like, you know, okay, there's influence. You can see Picasso and Miro and almost everybody in the period, and maybe a few other people. But they're taking it and they're doing their thing with it. They had to be very original. And so, because so much of it was the approach to material, the way that you applied material was very important. If you copied them, and nobody copied Pollock, you know, because except for maybe Mathieu, but you know, he didn't do it the same way.
You'd be surprised how many copies of Pollock there are.
Oh yeah, there's millions.
I get one every week.
No, there are millions. But I mean, they had to.
They're not very good.
They had to be very careful in the sense of, you know, not following somebody else. So everybody was kind of trying to find their thing. And the second generation, I guess you could say, were people that more did rely very much on some of the people, but it doesn't really break out very cleanly in terms of first, second, third, whatever. It's a convenient format. So that's that, but really it had to do with everything that had to do with how you applied paint. Now Jim worked on the floor and with stretch canvases, or he'd start on the floor and then stretch a canvas. He used buckets of paint to get those big, especially these kinds of later, a little bit later, I mean, there's all kinds of paintings, but in the big room, those later paintings were, those big expanses of color were buckets of paint and then squeegees, and that was before David Reed. But Jim didn't really care for making a squeegee mark, although there are a couple places where there are squeegee marks, and that's interesting if you look at Reed. But that was the way in which his applications were completely unique. So, you know, people covering large surfaces, scale was a huge pun for abstract expressionism. You needed to have paintings that were big enough to live in and not be windows. They needed to be walls. And so working large, how do you actually, what's the problem? How do you get all that paint on over all that, you know? So that was kind of, you know, I'd say, one of the markers were that people had to have their own approaches to applying paint, and then their iconography, whatever else that they were dealing with. I mean, there is abstraction, but it is abstracted from something. And so it has to relate to something.
So that brings you around to the titles. What you said earlier when we were in the galleries, that there was meaning behind the titles. Yeah, let's get to that.
Okay. So everybody's asking about the titles and what do they mean. They are made up words, but not all of them. A couple of them were from these really obscure towns in Texas that have really weird, you know, names, right? You know, the little tiny towns that have some kind of weird name. But the really great thing about the titles is that it was a numbering system of sequence. So every year, the first painting of the year starts with an A, next painting is a B, next painting is a C, next painting is a D. So he made up the words, but with following the alphabet. So he knew what the sequence was of every year of every painting he made. And that's freaking genius, right? That's how you keep track of the whole thing. And he had fun, yes, making up the words. And to your point, Klaus, and to others' point, no meaning, so that you don't know what it means. So you can't say, oh, that's a flower pot, or that's the ocean, or whatever. So he avoided the pitfalls of the names.
Elybrook which is a local
Ely Brook,
yeah.
right.
And there's also one from 1956 called Jackson.
Oh, occasionally there's a name.
So there are a few
Yeah,
references.
there's
and
a
that's
town called
obviously a
Jackson.
homage.
I'm
Oh,
going to
that's it.
Jackson.
Oh, right.
but
Jackson, Mississippi.
Who knows? Who knows which Jackson it was? But
So
we're learning-
1956 is kind of a
yeah,
giveaway.
kind of a giveaway. Well, I mean, yeah, every once in a while there's that. But basically what he was doing was creating this sequence so he knew, and it was really just for the big paintings. So a lot of the drawings and stuff are numbered. I mean, there might be a title here and there. But unlike, you know, so that was really what it was about. And so you can track, you know, a Qualm, which is one of the ones that's at the Modern. It's a bad slide of it here, but a really amazing painting. You know, okay, we know that Q is probably later on in the year. And I think there was 1 year or maybe 2 years where he went beyond Z and had and I think the next one was like 2 A's for the first 2 letters of the next one, something like that.
Like a hurricane naming system almost.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So we're learning a lot here. Like these are all things that are, you know, just interesting topics that you can delve into an artist's kind of their worldview or how they think. Klaus, is there anything that surprised you putting together this show about James' work, his practice?
Well, I think for me the most surprising thing was just, you know, his life story. You know, starting out in Texas, and then coming to New York and becoming this really accomplished muralist. Mm-hmm. Then the whole thing with him being a combat artist and being sent by the U.S. government to World War II to document what he saw there, as a painter with watercolors and watercolors and drawings, and then you know, becoming an abstract artist after having been a very, very skilled and accomplished representational artist, really. All of that, I think, was really surprising to me, and that's why I really decided I wanted to have all of that, you know, represented in the exhibition, and so therefore there's quite a lot of these combat works. It was a very short period of his life, but I thought there's not a lot of people even know about that happened.
Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot of these artists at the time, and during World War II, they were employed for their artistic talents. I think that's a really interesting historical, you know, time where we don't have, I don't think we have combat artists today going into war zones.
I think there were a few artists that went to Iraq,
yes.
I remember.
Yes, I did meet one, but it's kind of this rare thing now.
But they weren't sent there by the government.
Yeah.
So this started in World War I. There were 8 artists that were sent in World War I, and there were, you know, arguments made at the time that it is very important that artists are the real, true witnesses of you know, our history, and they need to be there. And so they sent eight artists there, and in World War II they sent about 100. So, and then I think it stopped. And of course we have photojournalists, and we had them then, and we have them now still, that take photographs. But there's something about how artists see things that's different from how a camera can see things. Mm-hmm. And there were, you know, the guy who was behind all this in World War II and wrote the letter to invite them. He talked about Velázquez and Goya and all those artists who would, you know, paint war scenes and how important it is. And you know, Congress, you know, immediately stopped it. So after a few months, and then they found alternate funding, so the artists could stay there. But it was, you know, it was a very short-lived government supported action, but it was.
Reuben Kadish was another who was one, and he went to Burma and India, and it really affected him for the rest of his life.
You know, one of the things that maybe it's in the archive somewhere, but I remember seeing maybe it was a photograph of it. It might have been the real copy. In the World War II, there was a newspaper that they published for the soldiers called Yankee, you know, and they reproduced some of his work. How it got utilized was, first of all, they wanted to compare the difference between an artist rendering of something that might have happened, and photographers, because they needed, it was like having, B-roll. But it was also to kind of entertain the guys as they published photographs, but having art in the newspaper was kind of a nice thing, and his work got published and other people's work. It's got to be somewhere.
Yeah. And a lot of the work was given to the government, and it's still in the government collection. And there was at least one exhibition they did, maybe several, of works from these combat artists in Washington.
I'd like to just now kind of transition into talking about the studio and this very unique property. Helen, can you describe James' studio design, the process of building it, some of the other buildings on the Brooks Park site? There's a number of these buildings, and I think they kind of played a large part in both of their lives.
Well, the original house, which was in Montauk, they didn't own the land. They only owned the buildings. And when the studio was destroyed by Hurricane Carol in 1954, they didn't want to rebuild on that land that they didn't own. So they bought the Springs land and moved the buildings that survived, which was the house itself, which has a little extension on it. And you can see it in that slide. It's kind of sticking up like a tail on the house when it was being barged across Accabonac. And then they also had a smaller building that they called the guest house, which I don't think it would be all that comfortable spending the night in there because it was just 4 walls and a roof, but it was also brought over. So those 2 buildings did survive, and those are still there today. Then at some point, and there's a wonderful interview, a video interview with Meg Perlman, who was helping Jim and Charlotte in the beginning, setting up the foundation. And they mentioned that they found this little building at the Wainscott Post Office and bought it from the post office department and had it moved onto the property. And that became Jim's studio first, before he built the big one. And then he designed this building himself, the large studio. In 1959, we have the original drawings, the measured drawings that he did for the builder. And they kept everything. The documentation is absolutely wonderful. A lot of material in the Archives of American Art. And it talks about buying the lease, getting the insurance, everything you could imagine. So it's very, very well documented. And then the next building they added to the house. In I think 1970, they put that room on the south side of the house, and then a smaller room on the other side where Charlotte had a little ramp to get in when she was disabled. So that building survives. It's not in great shape, but it is certainly revivable. And the other 2 smaller buildings are also there. They're not in original condition, but they certainly could be brought back. The studio is more problematic because the pictures that you saw of it there, it does not look like that today. So whether or not that could ever be restored, we don't know. It would be expensive to do, and whether the town would be willing to put the money in. But the others could be definitely rehabilitated and used for public use and enjoyment. And I see we have Marietta Guevara here in the audience and Janet Jennings, who are very much prime movers in this effort. So thank you guys for jumping on and really taking this up.
Yeah, thank you. There's a great effort now underway for this whole property, and a lot of people want to see that happen. It's part of how I and others have said that this is part of the constellation of the Springs and why it's such an important cultural area, not just for the artists, but also for the natural setting that it's in.
That's very important that you mentioned that, because not only were they artists, visual artists, but they had the kind of artistic sensibility that responds so strongly to their surroundings. Charlotte, and I think there's a slide of it that you put up there, Mike, that showed Charlotte's journals. She kept nature journals. What was on the property, when the deer came, when the birds came, all the different times of day and the seasons, and they're just wonderful little snapshots of the surrounding life, not just, it rained today, but really looking at nature, looking at the environment and responding to it. And I think for, having it as a nature center as well as an art center, I think is very important. And it would have pleased them very much.
Can I just speak to a couple
Yeah,
of these
please.
things? In terms of the design of the studio, when Jim designed those clear stories, the way the skylights go, first of all, there's sighting, like what direction is it going to face? And there's a difference between, artist studios have always traditionally been all about north light because it's the most neutral light. It changes the least. So if you're doing a portrait of somebody, you don't want the direction of light to change very much. That's how it originated back, I don't know, 1,000 years ago or something. But, and this is a little anecdotal. So Jim knew what that was, and it's not magnetic north. It's a certain, whatever longitude you're at, you have to understand when that perfect day is going to be in February that you kind of got.
Compensate.
Yeah, and compensate for it. So he knew that. But by designing that double light where
Sawtooth,
you have
right.
two slants and those lights hitting it, what happens is that light comes through them and hits those ceilings and comes down onto that floor. And the way that he did that made that entire surface exceptionally even in natural light. He did not work in artificial light. He didn't work at night. He only worked in the day. He never had bulbs on. There were some bulbs in there, but, And so the natural light was really important to him. And when he designed it and built it, Frederick Kiesler, who was a well-known architect, he had designed Peggy Guggenheim's, part of Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery and things like that, was familiar with Bauhaus and all the rest of it, although he wasn't a Bauhaus architect, I don't believe. But he was a very advanced thinker. He said that was the best artist studio he'd ever seen in that era, and that's pretty high praise. Charlotte, and we should talk a bit more about Charlotte, really, because they were really a team, and her sensibility was such that there was a point at which they could have afforded to have built her a bigger studio. She declined. She said, I don't want to have to account for that kind of space. She was very much involved with nature, and her practice, to go back to your original question, was to wander through the woods, pick things up. I mean, they had moss that grew so extensively, especially around her studio. It was like being on a carpet, It was a magical little kingdom there. And acorns and sticks that went a certain way. And in some of these drawings, there it is right there, perfect timing. Those are the designs of sticks that she picked up, So she was really doing a very advanced kind of work. I mean, she had been a very strong abstract expressionist and done larger paintings. I mean, I think some of her work is really strong for all the women that painted in the day. But as they moved there and as she advanced in age, she became a different artist. I would say much more contemporary, really, than Jim in that way of her sensitivity to the environment. And the diaries of nature, the objects that she collected to inspire her, that was really advanced stuff. And even though they were like this big, so what, So that was kind of it. But that studio was really exceptional. And one little anecdote, and then I'll stop. My dad had the same builder build his studio and house on Baiting Hollow in the following year, in '62. And it was Pete Reichart, who some people who are local will know that name. And it was same salt boxes, but not designed like Jim's. My dad should have designed more like Jim's. But he did site it correctly with the north light. And the next year or so is when Bill de Kooning built his big studio. And Sid and Bill had an argument because Bill thought it was magnetic north. And Sid said, you build it magnetic north, and you're going to get west light. And that's why are those louvers if you've ever been in there, all those big vertical louvers, because that studio gets west light, because Bill didn't listen to Sid.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, great. Well, I think this has been a great discussion. I think we're going to open it up now for questions from the audience. Yeah, and thank you. This was all really enlightening. I learned so much, and I'm thinking I'm one of, I'm very, familiar with the site, but now just knowing all of these additional kind of backstories, it's really kind of a beautiful thing. So, yeah, let's have Corinne.
Thank you so much.
Do we need a mic or?
We could repeat the question.
Yeah. I'm just curious, you, Scott, as a young artist who lives out here, what does Brooks mean to you personally?
Okay. Yeah, I think James Brooks' work, and I mean really both of them, Jim and Charlotte, I didn't know them, but I have a kinship to their sensibility. Absolutely, I'm a person of this place, and as an artist, the natural world is primarily what I'm looking at, and for me, the site, their work, and the world that they created there really resonates with me in a very special way. Yeah, we're separated by a few generations, but there's something timeless in that work and in the site that, yeah, really speaks to me personally. So I would have loved to meet them, and I think I probably would have gotten along pretty well. Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah.
We're familiar with the famous metaphor of Picasso Brock and the mountain climbers pulling each other up higher and higher. These artists chose to co-locate here, and to what extent, and perhaps this is for Klaus, did their proximity together as a community incubate and accelerate this profound movement of abstract expression?
Okay. Yeah. So the question is, yeah, how did these artists help each other? And I think.
Yes, I think it's a very good question. I think that is indeed true. Abstract expressionism, it's considered a kind of a loose group of artists that exchanged ideas but definitely there's different answers to this. When I'm looking at James Brooks and Jackson Pollock in particular, I think that's very interesting to me. So Brooks had some very, very close friendships. One was with Jackson Pollock, one was with Philip Guston, he, I think when he moved out here to Montauk in around 1950, I think there was a very close, very, very close relationship between him and Jackson Pollock. You can see it, there's so many photographs. You can see them walking together. You can see them in their studios. So there must have been conversations about what they were doing.
Jackson Pollock visited Jim and Charlotte on the day of his death. Mm-hmm. He actually drove to Montauk with the two women who were visiting with him, and for whatever reason, he needed to see Jim. And I think that's very touching, that there must have been some need to reach out when Jackson was at his wit's end. But the idea of having a kind of nexus of artists where you have Jackson and Lee moving out first, and then the others following, and then pretty soon the Springs, what is it now, 80 artists in the Springs? I'm one under every rock, my God. It's frightening.
Everyone's an artist.
There's another aspect to go to your question that Charlotte said to me once, that in the early days, but she was talking about out here, she said, in the afternoons we would go to each other's studios just to see if it was okay to be doing what we were doing. That's how she put it. And I remember it very explicitly. Because it was now we're so used to it, but then it was really weird. It was strange to do what they were doing. And the attention that you get, you say, oh, sure, you claim it and all the rest of it, but that was not really the vibe. It was like, what the heck is this? These are difficult decisions to make in terms of painting, and it goes to you know, what you brought up about Jim at the beginning about being in the painting and kind of, I mean, you really do have to live in these things, because how do you make a decision whether a red line should be here or there? You're not painting a cup where you know this, how to make it. You don't have anything to reference. So without reference, how do you make your decisions? And so I think that they bonded over that difficulty.
Well, we have a wonderful interview with Lee where she talks about facing the blank canvas. She says, there's nothing more horrifying than a blank canvas. Where do you start? Where does it come from? It comes from somewhere inside, and you have to summon that up. So having the support of your fellow artists, encouragement, beyond criticism or anything like that, just like keep doing it, keep working it. I think that was really crucial. Nothing to do with style either. Just keep doing the work.
It's there, and you can see it. You can see it in this exhibition. When you look at Brooks's works from between 1950 and 1960, you can see him working Pollock into his work, and then you see him working him out of his work. You mean he's really in conversation with that work, and he's trying to find his own, you know, and you saw that with Osorio too, and you see this with these artists, and it's in there, and I think that's what's so important. And that's a natural process. That's how artists work.
I like that you put those two little Picassoid drawings in as well, because Picasso was, you know, the elephant in the room, and they're all working their way past Picasso. And Jim was able to come up with something with all these other influences flowing around as well, that he was able to synthesize and then overcome all of those things and come up with a very individual approach. And again, it's not a style, it's an approach, it's a way of working.
You're talking about these two cubist drawings.
Right.
They look kind of like a George Condo, actually, but they're
Or verse of Isa.
yeah, right. But they're he took classes in Cubism when he came to New York.
Yeah.
Brooks did, and then there is, you know, in that one gallery you see he's really absorbing other artists like Miro, who was very important to him, and also Paul Klee, and all of this. He's going through these things, and this is what artists do.
Yeah.
Jane.
You mentioned before that Charlotte and James were a team. Could you talk a little bit more about really their process together, how they interacted about their art, what they...
You know, they met in Washington, D.C., which is where she was sort of orphaned. Her father had died when she was young, and her mother dated a lot and married a man who didn't really want to have anything to do with the kids. And so Charlotte and her brother got sent to the grandparents in Massachusetts. And then the mother came and grabbed them a few years later and took them to Washington, D.C. with the new husband. And so Charlotte had kind of a rough time of it in that sense. And she was working for the OS, what's it called? The special, the OS, yeah, OS. And it was like a special services of the government during the war. She was actually assigned to carry, and this speaks to her character, when the United Nations signed the charter in 1948 in San Francisco, they chose Charlotte to carry the signed document back to the vaults. So that was kind of what speaks to her character. And so when they met, I think that Jim was a very gentle man who was older than her, and so there was a kind of bond there between these two kind of very ethical, gentle people. And that, in that sense, they were a team. And Charlotte was a very dynamic painter in those, always, but in those years, in terms of abstract expressionism, hers are among the more gutsy, hardcore paintings of any of the women that painted. She was in early shows in New York. And so they also bonded because they were both very serious artists who didn't get in the way of each other, who really supported each other. And as life evolved and they came out here and they moved to Springs, there was always this, I never, in all the years that I was with them, heard an argument. They had a wonderful way of treating each other. I'm sure they had arguments, but not in front of anybody. And there was that. And she was supportive of him, and he was supportive of her. And it was just a kind of remarkable equilibrium that they managed to keep. I've never really seen it in artists or non-artists, really. They just really loved each other. And they knew that given the time and place, that the way for them, I mean, she taught, they both taught a bit, but she taught art classes for kids at MoMA and out here and at other institutions. But they knew that Jim's work would support them both so that they could paint. And so she definitely did a lot to organize his work and catalog it and do all those things that, you know, would now be a job for someone else. So there was that. There was definitely a supportive role that she took in that. But it was also because they could both do what they wanted to do. So there was really not many other options. Nobody was going to go out and get a job or whatever. So that was part of it. But it was just a very amicable relationship, a good relationship.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions here? Reen in the back.
Did both of them start creating as little kids?
I don't know. I really don't know.
That's a good question.
Well, Jim went to art school early on, right? When he was in Texas, he already went to art school. But where did Charlotte study?
I don't really know. Little kids, I'm thinking 5-year-olds. I can't go there.
Well, I've got just one more question, I think, to close it out. Can we all maybe even just give one last word about the idea of preserving artists' legacies, the studio preservation? Why is that important? Should we care about artists'
Well, you're
lives?
talking to the right person here.
I think we are, yeah.
Well, the museum has been open for 35 years now, and there's not a day that passes that we don't get a visitor who comes to the property and says, oh, now I understand. Now I see what was important to them. Now I see how it mattered that they were here and what they created here and how it relates to the surroundings. It really is a revelation, because when you go to a museum, you see beautiful display, an extraordinary exhibition, but the paintings are in a museum. They're divorced from the place where they were created. And to bring the human element back into it and the environmental element back into it, I think it really enriches the work in a way that you can't do any other way. So for us at the Pollock Krasner House, we don't have their art. We don't have their paintings. We actually have an exhibition of Lee's paintings up right now, but we don't own the work. So interpreting the studio as a place of creative energy is really what it's all about. And I have to say, it really moves people. And I think that all of these sites have that potential in their own way.
Yes, absolutely true. Even today, after 40-some years that I've been working as a curator and an artist, there's nothing more thrilling and more exciting for me than to go into an artist studio. And also more important in a way to even understand an artist fully is to see where the works are created. And it was Daniel Buren, a French artist who wrote an important essay in the 70s called The Function of the Studio, who talked about the studio is where truth happens, and once the works leave, part of that truth remains. It doesn't go with the work. And he praised Brancusi, who bequeathed his studio to the French state, but with the condition that a number of his works stay inside the studio, and they are still there, and they're in the one that's the reconstruction that's now next to the Pompidou. an artist studio is one of the most magical places. It's like the temple of the temples of the 21st century. It's very, very special. And I could think of nothing more important than to preserve these places. You know, and I think and to preserve them in a way that is befitting to the character of the artist. So I like that idea of the nature and art thing together in this particular case. I think it's beautiful.
You know, especially with abstract art, because you're not looking at a landscape and then you see a landscape painting of that landscape. But the natural surroundings, the experiences of being in nature infuses the work in a way that I think it becomes more accessible when you realize where it's coming from.
Yep.
What she said, what he said.
No, I think it's, you know, for me personally, obviously, it's a great sentiment for me to see. You know, what's really kind of amazing about this project is that there have been waves of people that have come who knew nothing about them originally and who have devoted a certain amount of time to keeping this saving of these buildings together. And there were a lot of odd fates that intervened in terms of Charlotte's planning and the foundation and all the rest of it, these odd happenings of people that things were left to that died and things like that. I mean, it's kind of a miracle. If you sort of think about the founding of a religion, this is like there were no apostles, you know, there were no nothing, and then yet people, when they learned about it, got very, very passionate about it. And today we have a very strong group of people who've gone before the town of East Hampton. They're pretty much on the verge of getting things okayed, and it will be preserved. And it's kind of extraordinary, really, that it's happened. And the perseverance of all the groups of people, that about 3 or 4 different groups of people that I've talked with sort of told the same story 3 or 4 times. But, you know, it's kind of extraordinary for me to watch this happen to it. So I really want to thank all of you, like Janet and you and Marianne, and for doing it, because this has really been great devotion to everything.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.